Summer evening 1998. A 13-year-old girl takes her dog for a walk and vanishes into the California dunes. The dog returns alone, leash dragging. 20 years of silence follow a family frozen in grief. A community haunted by questions. Evidence sealed in boxes, gathering dust. Then science evolves. DNA speaks where witnesses couldn't. A cold case breathes again. What took 2 decades to bury took 1 moment to resurrect. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The evening air hung warm and still over Seaside, California on June 12, 1998. Military housing stretched in neat rows across the former fort, or where Navy families like the Williams had recently settled after transferring from Japan. 13-year-old Christina Marie Williams clipped the leash to Greg's collar, her golden retriever eager for their nightly walk. "Be back before dark," her father called from the kitchen window. Christina waved and headed toward the familiar trails that wound through the abandoned military property. The base had been decommissioned years earlier, leaving behind a maze of empty buildings and overgrown paths that led to the coastal dunes. It was peaceful here, a place where a young girl could think, where her dog could run freely through the tall grass. An hour later, Greg returned alone. The leash dragged behind him across the driveway, his panting the only sound in the sudden stillness. Christina's parents stepped outside, calling her name. Their voices carried across the empty streets, bouncing off the walls of vacant barracks. By nightfall, panic had settled over the Williams household like fog rolling in from Monterey Bay. The missing person report was filed within hours. Local police coordinated with the FBI while remaining military police secured the fort perimeter. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit military community. Evening news bulletins interrupted regular programming. A 13-year-old girl had vanished from the quiet streets of Seaside, leaving behind only questions and a dog that couldn't speak. Dawn broke gray and cold over fort as hundreds of volunteers assembled in the pre-dawn darkness. Search and rescue teams spread across the dunes like a human net, their voices calling Christina's name into the wind. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors beating a steady rhythm against the morning sky. K-9 units worked the trails where Christina was last seen, following scent trails that led nowhere. Sheriff's deputies walked shoulder to shoulder through the tall grass, their eyes scanning for any trace of the missing girl. The FBI established a command center in an abandoned military building, coordinating efforts between local police, federal agents, and civilian volunteers. Maps covered every surface marked with grid patterns and search zones. Radio chatter filled the air, reports of possible sightings, false alarms, dead ends. By midday, a witness came forward claiming to have seen a man near the trail the previous evening. The description was vague, medium height, dark clothing, but it was something. Investigators canvassed the area, knocking on doors of nearby homes, questioning anyone who might have been in the vicinity. Media coverage intensified by the hour. News vans lined the streets outside Fort Ord, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Christina's school photo appeared on television screens across California. A smiling girl with bright eyes and hopes for the future. The community rallied around the Williams family. Neighbors organized meal trains, businesses donated supplies, and churches held prayer vigils. But as the sun set on the second day, Christina remained missing. July brought unbearable heat to the search effort. The initial urgency had given way to grim determination as days stretched into weeks without a trace. Christina's parents appeared on television, their faces etched with exhaustion and desperate hope. "Please," her father spoke into the cameras, his Navy training barely containing his emotion. "If someone has our daughter, just let her come home. That's all we want." The FBI had collected scent articles from Christina's bedroom clothing, personal items that carried her essence. Tracking dogs worked these trails repeatedly, following phantom scents that led to nothing but empty fields and abandoned buildings. A profile emerged from the Federal Behavioral Unit. The disappearance likely involved an abduction by someone familiar with the area, possibly a known predator. The assessment sent chills through Seaside. Parents began keeping their children indoors. The carefree atmosphere of the former military town dissolved into watchful suspicion. Tips poured in from across the state. Christina had been spotted in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in small towns along Highway 1. Each lead demanded investigation. Each hope crumbled under scrutiny. The command center's walls filled with dead-end reports and false sightings. Public fear grew with each passing day. Local news stations ran daily updates, showing the same school photo, repeating the same desperate plea for information. Children who once rode bikes freely through the neighborhoods now played only in fenced yards under parental supervision. As summer faded into silence, the terrible possibility began to settle over everyone. Christina might not be coming home. January 12, 1999, 7 months after Christina's disappearance, hikers exploring the remote sections of Fort made a discovery that would change everything. The skeletal remains lay partially concealed in a depression near an abandoned military building just 3 miles from the Williams home. The site was immediately cordoned off as investigators carefully documented every detail of the scene. Forensic examination confirmed what everyone had feared. But no, one wanted to believe the remains belonged to Christina Marie Williams. Her dental records provided positive identification, ending months of agonizing uncertainty with devastating finality. The medical examiner's report brought both answers and frustration. While the remains confirmed homicide, the cause of death could not be determined. Time and exposure had erased too many clues, leaving investigators with evidence of murder, but no clear indication of how Christina had died. The news hit Seaside like a physical blow. Shock headlines filled local papers. The missing person case that had consumed the community for 7 months was now officially a murder investigation. Evidence teams combed through every inch of the discovery site, collecting soil samples, fabric fragments, and anything that might yield forensic information. Christina's clothing, preserved despite months of exposure, was carefully bagged and transported to crime laboratories for analysis. The investigation entered a new phase 1 focused on evidence rather than search efforts. Detectives began building a case around what little physical material they had recovered, knowing that whoever had killed Christina had left traces behind. The community's vigils took on a different character, now no longer searches for the living, but memorials for the dead. The early 2000s brought new hope in the form of emerging DNA technology. Evidence collected from Christina's clothing was carefully processed and entered into the limited databases available at the time. The biological samples yielded a clear DNA profile male, unidentified with no match in the system. Investigators now had a genetic fingerprint of Christina's killer, but no name to attach to it. Attention focused on a local man with a troubling history. Charles Allen Holofield, a convicted sex offender whose previous crimes involved violent attacks against teenage girls. His criminal record painted a picture of escalating violence and predatory behavior that fit the FBI profile. Detectives approached Holofield's girlfriend, seeking to establish his whereabouts on the night of June 12, 1998. Her statement was unequivocal. Holofield had been with her all evening, watching television and drinking beer. The alibi was solid, corroborated by details that seemed impossible to fabricate. The investigation stalled without additional evidence to contradict the girlfriend's statement. Prosecutors could not move forward with charges. Holofield remained a suspect, but one protected by an ironclad alibi. Public frustration mounted as the case appeared to reach a dead end. Community members demanded answers that investigators simply could not provide. The Williams family maintained their dignified silence, attending memorial services and advocating for continued investigation. Evidence from the scene remained carefully preserved in climate-controlled storage, waiting for technology to advance or new information to emerge. The case files stayed open on detectives' desks, a constant reminder of justice delayed but not abandoned. The middle years of the 2000s brought quiet frustration to the Christina Williams investigation. Detectives rotated assignments, but the case files remained meticulously maintained, evidence preserved according to evolving forensic standards. Budget constraints limited the scope of forensic retesting as newer cases demanded resources. Christina's evidence sat in secure storage, protected but unused. While advances in DNA technology proceeded at laboratories across the country, the Williams family adapted to a new reality, living with permanent uncertainty while maintaining hope for eventual resolution. Annual memorial services became community tradition, keeping Christina's memory alive in a town that had learned to carry collective grief. Local law enforcement underwent changes as well. New officers joined the force, many unfamiliar with the original investigation, but briefed on its significance. The case became part of departmental culture, a reminder of the persistence required for true justice. Advances in DNA analysis were whispered about in forensic circles. Touch DNA, STR profiling, and enhanced sensitivity testing promised new possibilities for degraded samples. but these techniques remained expensive and largely experimental, unavailable to smaller jurisdictions like Monterey County. The community maintained its vigilance despite the passage of time. Christina's school friends graduated, went to college, started families of their own. Yet, her memory remained vivid. A young life cut short, a mystery that defined a generation's coming of age in Seaside. By 2010, more than a decade had passed since Christina's murder. The case appeared destined for permanent cold status, another file in the growing backlog of unsolved homicides. 13 years after providing Charles Allen Holifield's alibi, his former girlfriend walked into the Monterey County Sheriff's Office with a confession that would change everything. Sitting across from investigators in a sterile interview room, she spoke words that had been trapped inside her for more than a decade. "I lied. He wasn't with me that night." The recorded statement detailed years of fear and manipulation. Holifield had controlled her through intimidation, making her believe that lying to police was the only way to protect herself from his violence. The weight of that deception had eaten away at her conscience until she could no longer bear the guilt. "I kept thinking about that little girl," she said, tears streaming down her face about her family never knowing what happened. "I couldn't live with it anymore." The recantation shattered the barrier that had protected Holifield for 13 years. Investigators immediately recognized the significance. The alibi that had stalled the investigation was built on coercion and fear. News of the development spread quickly through law enforcement channels. The district attorney's office began reviewing the case files, weighing the implications of the new testimony against the aged evidence. Community whispers grew louder as word leaked about significant developments in the Christina Williams case. Local newspapers picked up the story, reporting that new information had emerged in the long-dormant investigation. The Williams family received a carefully worded phone call from investigators. There had been a breakthrough, and the case would be reopened with renewed focus. The Monterey County Forensic Laboratory in 2016 bore little resemblance to its counterpart from 1999. Advanced equipment lined the walls, machines capable of extracting DNA from samples once considered too degraded for analysis. Christina's evidence had been waiting 18 years for this moment. Her clothing, carefully preserved in climate-controlled storage, yielded biological material that earlier technology could not interpret. STR DNA profiling and touch DNA analysis revealed profiles invisible to previous testing methods. The breakthrough came on a routine Tuesday morning. A forensic analyst stared at computer screens displaying genetic markers, comparing the DNA profile extracted from Christina's clothing against samples in the expanding CODIAS database. The match appeared with mathematical certainty. Charles Allen Holifield. Probability calculations showed odds of approximately 1 in several billion that the DNA belonged to anyone else. Laboratory supervisors verified the results through multiple independent tests. Chain of custody documentation was reviewed and confirmed intact. The evidence that had waited nearly 2 decades finally had a voice. Phone calls went out immediately to investigating officers and prosecutors. After 18 years of wondering, they finally had irrefutable proof connecting Holifield to Christina's murder. The legal team began preparing for what they knew would be a complex prosecution. Holifield's defense would certainly challenge the age of the evidence, the chain of custody, and the reliability of DNA testing on degraded samples. But the science was clear, the documentation complete. Christina Marie Williams could finally have her day in court, even if she could not be there to see it. April 2017 brought media attention back to Seaside for the first time in years. The Monterey County District Attorney's Office had called a press conference to announce developments in the Christina Williams case. Reporters packed the courthouse steps as the district attorney approached the microphones. The Williams family stood nearby, their faces reflecting 19 years of patient waiting. Today, we announce the arrest of Charles Allen Holifield for the kidnapping and murder of Christina Marie Williams, the prosecutor declared. Advanced DNA testing has provided the evidence needed to move forward with representing our Live 70 prosecution. The announcement detailed the scientific breakthrough that had cracked the case. Touch DNA analysis, revealing Holifield's genetic material on Christina's clothing. The technology that had seemed like science fiction in 1998 had become routine forensic practice by 2016. Holifield's criminal history was presented to the media, a pattern of sexual violence against young women stretching back decades. Previous convictions demonstrated escalating behavior that culminated in Christina's murder. Public reaction was swift and emotional. Relief mixed with outrage as community members processed the news. The man they had suspected for years would finally face justice. But questions remained about the years lost to a false alibi. Local television stations led their evening broadcasts with the arrest announcement. Social media exploded with commentary from residents who remembered the original search efforts. The case would now move through the court system. But after 19 years of uncertainty, the Williams family finally had answers. Justice had been delayed, but it would not be denied. Pretrial motions began in earnest throughout 2018 as Holifield's defense team mounted challenges to the prosecution's evidence. The central issue became the integrity of DNA samples preserved for nearly 2 decades. Defense attorneys questioned every aspect of evidence handling, from the original crime scene collection to long-term storage protocols. They argued that 18 years had provided numerous opportunities for contamination or degradation. Chain of custody documentation became crucial. Prosecutors produced meticulous records showing how Christina's evidence had been maintained under federal standards since its collection in 1999. Temperature logs, access records, and handling procedures demonstrated the integrity of the preservation process. Local talk radio buzzed with debate about the case. Some callers questioned whether justice delayed so long could still be meaningful. Others argued that Christina deserved her day in court regardless of the time elapsed. Monterey County Superior Court became the focal point for renewed community attention. The courthouse steps where the arrest had been announced now hosted regular gatherings of supporters and protesters alike. Legal experts weighed in on television news programs discussing the precedent-setting nature of the case. DNA evidence from the 1990s had never been tested with such advanced techniques. Before going to trial, the defense filed multiple motions to suppress evidence, challenging not just the DNA testing but also the circumstances of the girlfriend's recantation. Each motion was carefully argued and ultimately denied by presiding judges. By late 2019, it became clear that the case would proceed to trial. All pretrial challenges had been exhausted, and the evidence would finally be presented to a jury. December 2019 brought an unexpected development that would reshape the entire trial process. Charles Allen Holifield made a decision that surprised prosecutors, defense attorneys, and court observers alike. In a quiet courthouse chamber, Holifield signed legal documents, waiving his right to a jury trial. More significantly, he also waived his right to future appeals, effectively limiting his options if convicted. The decision meant that a single judge, Pamela Butler, would determine his fate. No panel of 12 citizens would weigh the evidence. Instead, one experienced jurist would evaluate the case and render verdict. Legal analysts debated the strategy behind Holifield's decision. Some suggested he hoped to avoid the emotional impact of victim testimony on a jury. Others believed he was trying to avoid the possibility of a death penalty recommendation from citizen jurors. The Williams family received news of the waiver with mixed emotions. Some saw it as cowardice, an attempt to avoid full accountability before the community he had harmed. Others viewed it as a path to closure that avoided the uncertainties of jury deliberation. Judge Pamela Butler accepted the waiver and began preparing for a bench trial. Her reputation for fairness and analytical precision made her well suited for the emotional case ahead. Community reaction was divided. Local newspapers published editorials questioning whether Holifield deserved the right to choose his form of trial. Letters to the editor revealed deep feelings about justice and procedure. A bench trial was scheduled for early 2020, ending 2 decades of waiting with a promise of resolution. March 2020 arrived with unusual tension in Monterey County Superior Court. The Christina Williams murder trial was finally beginning. 22 years after a 13-year-old girl had vanished from a Seaside trail, Judge Pamela Butler called the proceedings to order as lawyers took their positions. The courtroom was packed despite media restrictions, with Christina's family occupying the front row and community members filling every available seat. The prosecutor's opening statement was methodical and measured. The case would be built on 3 pillars: DNA evidence linking Holifield to Christina's clothing, his pattern of violent crimes against young women, and the timeline that placed him in the area when Christina disappeared. The evidence will show that Charles Holifield abducted, attacked, and murdered Christina Marie Williams. The prosecutor stated, "Advanced forensic science has given Christina a voice she was denied in life." Defense attorney countered by questioning the reliability of 18-year-old evidence. He argued that time had degraded not just the physical samples, but also the memories of witnesses who would testify about events from decades past. This case asks you to accept conclusions based on evidence that has passed through countless hands over 2 decades. The defense argued, "The passage of time creates reasonable doubt about everything we think we know." Judge Butler listened intently, taking notes as both sides outlined their strategies. The emotional weight of the case was evident in the courtroom's atmosphere. Years of grief and hope condensed into legal arguments about science and memory. The trial's midpoint arrived with testimony that would prove decisive. Forensic experts took the witness stand to explain the DNA evidence that had cracked the case wide open. Dr. Sarah Chen, the laboratory supervisor who had overseen the 2016 testing, presented her findings with scientific precision. Charts and graphs filled the courtroom screens, showing genetic markers that matched Holofield's DNA to samples from Christina's clothing. The STR analysis revealed a complete DNA profile. Dr. Chen testified the probability that this DNA belongs to someone other than Mr. Holofield is approximately 1 in 4 billion. The defense attorney pressed her on contamination possibilities, questioning every step of the testing process. Dr. the 40-teen Ben Chen remained calm and thorough, explaining the multiple safeguards that prevented cross-contamination in modern forensic laboratories. "We tested the evidence multiple times using different techniques," she explained. "Each test confirmed the same genetic markers. The results are scientifically certain." Press headlines that evening proclaimed cold case breakthrough as news outlets across California reported on the forensic testimony. Legal experts called the DNA evidence overwhelming and virtually unassailable. The prosecution had gained significant momentum. Holofield's defense team faced the challenge of casting doubt on evidence that appeared scientifically bulletproof. Community reaction was swift and emotional. Local television stations interviewed longtime residents who remembered the original search efforts. Many expressed relief that modern science had finally provided answers that had eluded investigators for 2 decades. The trial was approaching its climax with the most devastating evidence yet to come. The courtroom darkened as prosecutors presented a digital reconstruction of Christina's final walk. Through Forder maps and satellite imagery, filled the large screens showing the route from her home to the discovery site. Investigators had spent months creating the presentation, overlaying 1998 photographs with modern GPS coordinates to recreate the scene as it existed when Christina disappeared. The abandoned military buildings, overgrown trails, and isolated areas where a crime could occur unobserved were mapped with precision. This analysis shows the probable path Christina took that evening. The lead detective testified the abduction likely occurred in this area approximately half a mile from her home. A witness who had remained silent for over 20 years came forward with new information. She recalled seeing a vehicle similar to Holofield's pickup truck parked near the trail entrance on June 12, 1998. The memory had been dismissed at the time as irrelevant, but DNA evidence had given it new significance. The defense challenged the reliability of decades-old memories, arguing that media coverage had contaminated witness recollections. The cross-examination was intense but failed to shake the witness's core testimony. Emotional reactions were visible throughout the courtroom gallery. Christina's father sat with his hands clasped tightly, his jaw set as he listened to testimony about his daughter's final moments. The reconstruction painted a vivid picture of isolation and opportunity, a young girl walking alone through an area where predators could operate without detection. The setting had provided perfect conditions for tragedy. The prosecutor's case reached its emotional peak with testimony about Holofield's pattern of violence against young women. Certified records documented a decades-long history of sexual assault and violent crimes. Previous victims, now adult women, took the witness stand to describe attacks that bore striking similarities to Christina's case. The pattern was unmistakable. Holofield targeted teenage girls in isolated areas using intimidation and physical violence to control his victims. He approached me near the bus stop. One survivor testified, "I was 15. He said he would kill me if I screamed." The testimony was devastating in its consistency. Multiple women described similar tactics, similar threats, and similar violence. The attacks had escalated over time, suggesting that Christina's murder represented the culmination of Holofield's criminal progression. Defense attorneys objected repeatedly to the pattern evidence, arguing that prior bad acts were prejudicial and irrelevant to the specific charges. Judge Butler overruled most objections, finding that the evidence demonstrated a clear behavioral pattern relevant to Christina's case. Survivor advocacy groups issued statements supporting the victims who had found the courage to testify. The women had carried these traumatic experiences for decades, and their willingness to speak publicly was seen as both brave and crucial to the pursuit of justice. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavier with each testimony. Christina's family listened as prosecutors built an irrefutable case that Holyfield was not just a suspect, but a serial predator whose violence had finally been exposed. The prosecution rested its case with confidence that the evidence spoke for itself. The defense's case relied heavily on procedural challenges and scientific skepticism. Holyfield's attorneys argued that 2 decades had created too many opportunities for error, contamination, and false conclusions. Cross-examination of the DNA analyst focused on statistical interpretation and laboratory protocols. The defense suggested that the complex testing procedures used on degraded samples could produce misleading results. Isn't it true that touch DNA analysis is less reliable than traditional DNA testing? The defense attorney questioned. The forensic expert maintained her position. Touch DNA has been validated through thousands of cases. The techniques we used are scientifically accepted and legally admissible. The defense also emphasized the absence of a murder weapon or clear cause of death. They argued that while DNA proved contact between Holyfield and Christina, it did not necessarily prove murder. DNA evidence shows Mr. Holyfield had contact with the victim, the defense stated, but contact does not equal murder. The prosecution has failed to prove how Christina Williams died. Public opinion began to split between those who found the DNA evidence conclusive and others who questioned whether reasonable doubt remained. Local newspapers published editorial commentary examining both sides of the scientific debate. The defense presentation was thorough, but failed to generate the skepticism needed to overcome the prosecution's evidence. Emotional exhaustion was visible throughout the courtroom as the trial neared its conclusion. Judge Butler prepared to weigh all evidence and render a verdict that would finally close one of California's longest-run cold cases. March 20, 2020, arrived with palpable tension in Monterey County Superior Court. After weeks of testimony and months of preparation, Judge Pamela Butler was ready to deliver her verdict. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Christina's family sat in the front row, their faces reflecting 22 years of patient waiting. Media representatives filled the gallery while community members stood along the walls. Judge Butler entered precisely at 9:00 a.m. Her expression was solemn but composed as she reviewed the thick folder of evidence before her. The court has carefully considered all evidence presented, Judge Butler began. The DNA evidence linking the defendant to the victim's clothing is scientifically valid and legally conclusive. She methodically reviewed each element of the prosecution's case, addressing the defense's challenges point by point. The pattern of prior violence, the timeline evidence, and the forensic testimony all supported a finding of guilt. The court finds the defendant guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances. Judge Butler declared, "The evidence proves beyond reasonable doubt that Charles Allen Holyfield kidnapped and murdered Christina Marie Williams." Silence fell over the courtroom. Christina's father closed his eyes and took a deep breath. 22 years of wondering had finally ended. Breaking news alerts went out across California as reporters rushed to file their stories. The Christina Williams case had finally reached its conclusion, but the emotional impact was only beginning to be felt. Sentencing would follow, but the verdict itself represented justice long delayed yet finally delivered. The sentencing hearing took place later that afternoon. In the same courtroom, Judge Butler had reviewed California's sentencing guidelines and considered the special circumstances that elevated the crime. The court sentences Charles Allen Holyfield to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Judge Butler announced the aggravated nature of this crime against a child demands the maximum sentence allowed by law. Holyfield showed no emotion. As the sentence was pronounced, his defense team made no statements and filed no motions for appeal. Consistent with his earlier waivers, the Williams family received the sentence with quiet dignity. After more than 2 decades of uncertainty, they finally had the closure they had sought through countless vigils, interviews, and public appearances. Legal experts noted the significance of the case for cold case prosecutions statewide. The successful use of advanced DNA testing on decades-old evidence would encourage other jurisdictions to re-examine their unsolved cases. Community reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Local news stations reported that justice had finally been served for Christina Marie Williams. The formal conclusion of the case marked the end of one chapter but the beginning of another. Christina's legacy would live on through the precedent her case had set for forensic science and cold case investigation. On the courthouse steps following sentencing, Christina's father addressed the media and community members who had gathered. His statement reflected both gratitude and the complex emotions of achieving justice after such a long wait. "Today we finally have answers," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion in his eyes. "We can stop wondering what happened to our daughter. We know who took her from us, and we know he will never hurt another family." He thanked the investigators who had preserved evidence for over 20 years, the forensic scientists who had developed the technology to analyze degraded samples, and the community that had never forgotten Christina's story. "Christina would be 35 years old today," he continued. "We can't bring her back, but we can honor her memory by ensuring that justice prevails, even when it takes decades to arrive." That evening, Seaside held a candlelight vigil at the memorial site where Christina was discovered. Hundreds of community members gathered, many holding photos of the young girl, who had become a symbol of persistence and hope. Local clergy offered prayers for Christina's family and for the healing of a community that had carried this burden for over 2 decades. The vigil was both a celebration of justice achieved and a mourning for the life that had been lost. The event drew media attention from across California, with news outlets highlighting the community's remarkable endurance through years of uncertainty. In the forensic laboratory, where the breakthrough had occurred, scientists reflected on the technological advances that had made Christina's case possible. The evolution from basic DNA testing to advanced STR analysis represented a revolution in criminal investigation. Dr. ESA 144 ESA Sarah Chen, who had led the testing team, explained how evidence preservation had been crucial to the case's resolution. The investigators in 1999 followed protocols that seemed excessive at the time. She noted their attention to detail made this conviction possible. 18 years later, the laboratory had become a model for other jurisdictions, seeking to resolve cold cases through advanced DNA testing. Requests for similar analysis had increased dramatically following the publicity around Christina's case. Diagrams showing the DNA match were preserved as evidence of the scientific certainty that had finally brought justice. The genetic markers that proved Hollifield's guilt represented the convergence of patience and technology. Renewed trust in forensic science emerged from the successful prosecution. Community members who had questioned whether old evidence could still be reliable found their confidence restored by the scientific rigor demonstrated in court. The case had also raised important questions about older unresolved investigations. Local law enforcement agencies began reviewing their cold case files, seeking similar opportunities to apply modern technology to preserved evidence. Funding for DNA analysis increased across California as legislators recognized the potential for resolving decades-old crimes. Christina's case had demonstrated that justice delayed did not necessarily mean justice denied. The Monterey County District Attorney's Office began using Christina's case as a model for cold case investigation and prosecution. The successful combination of witness reevaluation, advanced forensic testing, and persistent investigation became a template for other jurisdictions. Policy drafts for a formal cold case task force were developed, incorporating lessons learned from the Williams investigation. The protocols emphasized evidence preservation, regular review of advancing technology, and the importance of maintaining community connections. New state grants were approved specifically for DNA backlog reduction and cold case analysis. Christina's case had demonstrated the value of investing in forensic technology and long-term investigation efforts. Media coverage praised the perseverance shown by law enforcement agencies that had refused to abandon the case despite years without progress. The story became a symbol of what could be achieved when investigators maintained hope and communities demanded justice. Other families with missing or murdered loved ones began contacting the Monterey County Sheriff's Office seeking similar reviews of their cases. The success with Christina's investigation had renewed hope for families who had given up on finding answers. Legal experts noted that the case would likely influence cold case prosecution strategies nationwide. The successful use of advanced DNA testing on decades-old evidence provided a roadmap for similar investigations. The establishment of formal cold case protocols ensured that future investigations would benefit from the lessons learned through Christina's case. Her legacy extended beyond justice for her own family to improved procedures for all victims of unsolved crimes. A memorial plaque was dedicated at the fort or trailhead near where Christina's remains had been discovered. The ceremony brought together the community that had searched for her, grieved for her, and finally found justice in her name. The bronze plaque bore a simple inscription: Christina Marie Williams, 1985-1998. Forever in our hearts, never forgotten by her community. Former searchers attended the dedication, many now showing the gray hair and weathered faces that marked the passage of 2 decades. They had been young parents and teenagers when Christina disappeared. Now they brought their own children and grandchildren to honor her memory. Local officials spoke about the importance of community persistence in achieving justice. The case had demonstrated that ordinary citizens, through vigilance and advocacy, could make a difference in the pursuit of truth. Children from the local elementary school participated in a balloon release, sending white balloons into the coastal sky as a symbol of Christina's spirit. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a community's way of saying goodbye to a child they had never stopped trying to bring home. The memorial site became a place of reflection where visitors could contemplate the intersection of loss and justice. The trails where Christina had once walked with her dog were transformed from a scene of tragedy into a testament to community love and persistence. The dedication marked a transition from grief to remembrance, from uncertainty to peace. Seaside's town hall hosted a ceremony honoring the volunteers, investigators, and community members who had sustained the search for Christina Williams across more than 2 decades. Public service awards were presented to those whose efforts had made justice possible. The ceremony attracted representatives from law enforcement agencies across California who wanted to learn from Terry County's successful cold case prosecution. Christina's case had become a teaching tool for departments struggling with their own unsolved investigations. Local officials announced that over 200 cold cases statewide had been selected for reevaluation using similar techniques to those employed in the Williams investigation. The ripple effects of Christina's case would potentially bring closure to dozens of other families. Community members expressed a sense of pride mixed with exhaustion. They had maintained hope when hope seemed pointless, preserved evidence when technology couldn't yet use it, and demanded justice when justice seemed impossible. The ceremony also acknowledged the emotional toll that the long investigation had taken on everyone involved. Counseling services were made available for community members who needed support in processing the resolution of a case that had defined their lives for so long. Christina's father spoke briefly, expressing gratitude for the community that had never allowed his daughter to be forgotten. "You kept her alive in your hearts when we couldn't hold her in our arms," he said. The gathering represented the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a community moving from grief to healing while carrying Christina's memory forward. As sunset painted the sky above Fort or the trails where Christina Williams had taken her final walk, stood quiet and peaceful. The coastal wind rustled through the grass where searchers had once called her name, where evidence had waited decades to speak, and where justice had finally been served. Documentary film crews visited the site regularly, now drawn by the story of persistence that had captivated true crime audiences nationwide. The case had become a symbol of what could be achieved when communities refused to surrender hope. Christina's preserved case file was archived permanently in the Monterey County Records Facility, ensuring that future investigators could study the techniques that had brought closure after 22 years. Her case would teach new generations of forensic scientists and criminal investigators. The balance between closure and memory remained delicate. Justice had been served, but Christina would never come home. Her family had answers, but answers could not restore the decades of life that had been stolen. In the growing darkness, the memorial plaque caught the last light of day. The community that had searched for Christina mourned her and finally found justice in her name would continue to remember. Their persistence had proven that some truths are too important to remain buried, some voices too precious to be silenced by time. The Forter Trail stretched into shadow, transformed from a place of tragedy into a testament to the power of collective memory. Here, a 13-year-old girl's story had become larger than one family's grief. It had become a community's promise that no child would be forgotten, no case abandoned, no voice ignored. Charles Allen Hollifield would spend the rest of his life behind bars, but his conviction represented more than personal justice. It demonstrated that patience, science, and unwavering determination could overcome even decades of silence. As darkness settled over Seaside, the lights of homes flickered on across the former military base. Families gathered for dinner. Children played in yards that were safe again, and parents told bedtime stories with the comfort of knowing that justice, though delayed, had finally prevailed. Christina Marie Williams had found her peace. Her community had found its healing. And somewhere in the intersection of memory and justice, a young girl's legacy lived on a reminder that truth, like love, endures beyond time itself. The camera faded on trails where a community had refused to forget, where science had finally given voice to the voiceless, and where justice had proven that some stories are too important to end in silence.